Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Rob Clark, and he operates the Lone Gunman podcast. He's at about 200 shows, all researching the assassination of JFK. So I'm delighted to have him. I've also done some other interviews about people surrounding the JFK situation or case. I talked to Joseph Green, who has also been on the Lone Gunman podcast. I had an interview back in 2019 about George de Warnschild. It was the title of the book was Walking the Razor's Edge, The Dutchman and the Baron. And it was about a Dutch journalist who was friends with George de Warnschild and visited him in Dallas. And very strange, but true story. And I would recommend people listen to that. But we're going to talk and kind of go in. I saw a lot of names that look familiar to me about the JFK things, and a lot I didn't know. So I wasn't able. He does very well researched long episodes on certain facets of the JFK assassination, but he can talk more about that. So Rob Clark, welcome to the show. Thank you for agreeing to the interview.
Thank you, William. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Great. So for people who may not have heard of the Lone Gunman podcast or you, can you kind of talk about your background? What led you to start this show and kind of how you kind of conducted your research from the beginning?
Yeah, well, I've been interested in the assassination of probably about 30 or so years. Like a lot of people, the movie JFK really spurned my interest. And, then with the advent of the internet, it became a lot easier to do research and not just have to, scour around for books to read. And I started the show basically out of the necessity of wanting to talk about it with somebody. It's a very niche subject, and not a lot of people that might be immediately around you really care about it or anything. So I made some friends along the way, and just decided it would be cool to do a podcast about it. Started that about 7 or 8 years ago, and still here.
And there is a community, like I was talking with Joseph Green, and there's definitely a series of JFK researchers, goes back to Mae Brussel and some of these other personalities from the beginning. I was listening through one of your more recent ones, and you kind of have a lower impression on Fletcher Prudy, which I thought was interesting. But maybe you can talk about some of the people who came before you and who was researching and what you learned from them.
Yeah. I've read a lot of books. I have a lot of books, probably over 100 books. I read a lot. I take in a lot. I listen to a lot of shows. I've been to some conferences. And, over the years, I guess, certain authors unfortunately become married to certain theories. And in light of new evidence coming out, because we have all these document releases recently and through the 90s, a lot more information comes out that kind of doesn't go with their theory, if you will. And so it's very hard for me to really settle on, one quote famous researcher or another or somebody's work. I admire people that are open-minded and willing to admit that they made a mistake. One classic example of that is just Josiah Thompson, who I believe was in 1967, put out one of the very early books called 6 Seconds in Dallas. And, he put forth a theory in the book of how he thought things went down there in Dealey Plaza. And I got a chance to talk to him in 2019 at a JFK conference in Dallas. And this was before his most recent book came out. And he told me, over a couple beers in the bar, that he screwed up 50 years ago. And he felt the need to get things right this time. And his book just came out this past year, and I got it and read it. And there's a fantastic documentary on YouTube called JFK Unsolved that I would highly recommend everybody check out. And it goes a lot more into Josiah Thompson's new book and the work he put into it and the research that went into it. And it's very fascinating. He pretty much proves that the HSCA, which was the House Select Committee on Assassinations, that their conclusion was correct, that there was at least 4 shots, in Dealey Plaza, and one of them did come from the grassy knoll, and that the acoustic evidence stands up to this day, and in fact, proved it with up-to-date technology. So it's pretty fascinating stuff.
Right. So that contradicts the central narrative of the Lone Gunman, right?
Sure. And a lot of people forget about the HSCA investigation. They just tend to hear about the Warren report and all that, but they forget, in the 70s, everything was kind of reinvestigated, and their conclusion was that there was at least 4 shots, and one of them acoustically, came from the area of the grassy knoll. So,
right. And I mean, probably where there were more than 4 shots too. I mean, so I think there were a lot of bullets flying around. It seems like that day. I mean, when you started, I mean, and it's kind of like unraveled or unfolded or exposed more information from November 22nd, 1963 through the decades as people learn more and other facets were learned, right? Like it's and within the research community, it's kind of like they've just learned more over time, right?
yeah, for sure. But a couple things just don't change over time. You have there's a Zapruder film, and you have CE 399, which is the commission exhibit of the so-called magic bullet that they try to put forth as this bullet that made 7 wounds on 2 men, went through 2 different bones at least, and came out looking near pristine. And that just didn't sit right with a lot of people, and still doesn't.
Right. So there's a lot of evidentiary problems. And I think when I was looking through your podcast, you don't believe that anybody shot at the president from the book depository, right?
I don't believe so. In my opinion, and I have no factual evidence whatsoever to back this up, but when you look at everything that has been put out there, about the book depository and about the movements and the people inside the depository immediately after the assassination, and you try to figure out where people were, what people were actually in the building, and all of that, it just makes a little bit more sense to think that the rifle that was found on the 6th floor had been planted ahead of time along with the shells.
Right. And I think you talked about this book that came out, Buell Wesley Frazier. He was inside the book depository too. And you kind of critiqued his book, right?
I did. He's a strange character for sure. And a lot of things that he said over the years just don't add up to me. I've been very, very critical of him before he put his book out, because he's always stood by the fact that he swears that the so-called package that Oswald took to work that day was no more than 2 feet long. And of course, there was no 2-foot paper package found in the depository that day. And of course, a rifle couldn't fit into that size package. And in his HSCA interview, which is on tape, it's a 4-part thing, and some of it has been transcribed, and a couple of the tapes are very poor quality. But there is one quote that stands out to me, and I'll paraphrase it for you. I knew he had the rifle, or I knew he hid the rifle, and I stood there on the steps thinking, oh my God, I don't want to get drawn into this. So it sounds to me like Frazier either knew that Oswald had brought a rifle into the building and didn't want to be associated with it whatsoever. And that's I'm not saying it's anything nefarious, but if you're a 19-year-old kid accused of being an accomplice to murdering the president of the United States, you probably want to distance yourself as much as possible from the suspect.
Right. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, and you talk about this guy, Josiah Thompson, whose name I didn't know, but you looked into one of the earlier books, which was Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment too, right? Do you still think that book stands up over time?
I do. I appreciate everything that those first generation researchers did, whether it be good, bad, or indifferent. It's just more to add to the story. And of course, Mark Lane's been accused of a lot of things throughout the years, and who knows about his various tactics behind the scenes, and his editing of interviews with certain witnesses. But it's out there. It's valuable information that nobody looked into at the time other than him, and it's valuable. You just have to take it with a grain of salt and see where the puzzle pieces fit into the puzzle.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I mean, there's a lot. You don't just focus on Texas or Dallas on that day. You're looking around a lot of stuff. You look into Oswald, Mexico City. You talk about what's going on in New Orleans. And one thing I saw was there was an attempted assassination of Jim Garrison. I wasn't aware of that. Can you talk about that?
Actually,
Was there one? I thought I came across that. Maybe I'm wrong.
I may have titled something that from coming
Okay.
across a document, but I can't recall it offhand right this second, William.
Gotcha. And did you also kind of looked into what's the story of Oswald in Mexico City? Because I think Mae Brussel did something about him, and he was supposedly down there. I mean, he had a strange background. You do a lot of stuff about looking into Oswald's background. Can you talk about what he was up to and what you found out about him prior to November 1963?
Yeah, I mean, a lot about his life just is very weird and doesn't make sense to us today. Um, but if you go back in time, of course, and kind of put yourself in his shoes, he had two older brothers who went into the armed services ahead of him, and a very probably overbearing mother bothering him about every little thing. And they were moving around a lot, so it probably was hard for him to make friends or keep friends. Um, and he went into the Marine Corps. He followed his brother's footsteps, and he got an early discharge due to a supposed injury from his mother. And 3 days later, he's heading out on a freighter to England to ultimately make his way to Russia, where he wants to defect, allegedly, and stays over there and meets a young Russian lady, falls in love, apparently gets married a couple weeks later. She gets pregnant. They have a child in Russia, and then they proceed to come back to America. And of course, at this time of the Cold War, things were moving a little too smoothly for the Oswalds, as far as their exiting and entering different countries, and lack of debriefing, if you will, or State Department interference in his return. But the FBI was on their radar, and in fact, a lot of the problem with these women that married these so-called American defectors coming back were spies for Soviet Russia. So the FBI was, keeping an eye on the Oswalds for sure in New Orleans and Dallas.
Right. I mean, so it's 1959. It really is the height of the Cold War, and he's making these strange moves. Like, how does he finance it? And he worked in kind of a U-2 kind of air base in Japan too, right? Before that.
Yeah, that's correct. Over at Atsugi, so he had some information that the Soviets would have been interested in for sure.
Right. And I mean, so like even his yeah, so I mean, people are investigating his wife, and he just had, and then he takes on this kind of fair play for Cuba thing, which is very strange too, right? In New Orleans.
Yeah, very odd. This all started in New Orleans, in the spring of '63, and we have letters from him writing the head office of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New York, offering to open up a new chapter in New Orleans, and they really weren't too settled on that. So Oswald took it upon himself just to make up his own faction, if you will, down there, or try to anyway. And whether or not it was legit, who knows? But we do have him captured on film in a couple places, handing these leaflets out. Hands off Cuba, and of course, him putting the address of 544 Camp Street on the flyers is a problem.
Right, because it leads to the Guy Bannister. This is kind of the intro to Oliver Stone's film JFK, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and
Can you talk about that?
not only was Guy Bannister, in the building, not necessarily at that address, because the building kind of sat on a corner. So one side of the building faced, Lafayette Street, and the other side, I believe, was on Camp Street. But it's the same building, just two different entrances. With a restaurant at the bottom called Mancuso's, and the 544 Camp Street address was actually the former headquarters for the Cuban Student Directorate, which is one of these anti-Castro Cuban, uh, whatever you want to call it.
Organizations, right? It's
Yeah, it's
funded by the American
organizations.
government, right? Yeah.
Yeah, funded by the CIA. And so that's very interesting. A lot of people interviewed over the years said that they had seen Oswald in the building, that he kept his flyers there, that he had a little office on the second floor. Of course, none of which we can prove, but the allegations are there, and the the whole lead up to the assassination and what was going on in New Orleans is always uh, really fantasized me because I I think that a lot of the formulaic um, machinations for the assassination came together in New Orleans. And
Right.
there's some very curious characters, associated with Bannister and Ferry and all these guys down there in New Orleans that have come out over the years, such as little known figures like Thomas Beckham.
Can you talk about him? Who's Thomas Beckham?
Sure. He's actually still alive. He's a guy, I believe he was a con man back in the early 60s, jack of all trades, master none type of guy. He was a country and western singer. He was hanging around a lot of these guys down there, like David Ferry and another guy by the name of Jack Martin, who he alleged was a CIA guy down there. And so, all these guys kind of knew each other down there. And Beckham wrote a book in 2006 um, where he kind of came out and told his side of the truth. And the fascinating part of it was, if you go back and look at the declassified documents of the HSCA, they ran across this guy back in the 70s and interviewed him while he was in prison in Alabama. And he gave pretty much the same account, where he was told he was meeting with people like Ferry and Bannister and a couple other people in a lawyer's office down there. And he was told to take a package to Dallas. And he said he did, and met with a guy in Dallas by the name of Lawrence Howard, who kind of looked at the package and was like, is this it? This is all you got? He said, yeah, that's all they gave me. And he said he was very upset about it. And he said he got back on the plane and went back home. And that's all he knows. Very weird stuff.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, and Ferry was what? One of these weird bishops of New Orleans. I think you did a show on that. Like, there's just strange environment and working with a lot of Cubans, right wing Cubans. Like, things don't make sense that Ferry is hanging out with hanging out with right wingers while Oswald is parading as a left winger, right?
Yeah, for sure. Um, these a lot of these churches down in New Orleans were fronts to collect basically to store supplies and weapons for the anti-Castro Cubans and things like that. They were used to raise money for the cause. And supposedly, only certain people had keys to these churches, and very weird stuff. I would highly recommend people check out a lot of Peter Levenda's book. I believe it's the
Sinister Forces, yeah.
The Sinister Forces. Where he was actually posing as a some kind of religious official, and was able to make it into RFK's funeral unmolested and just unquestioned. And it's amazing what you can do when you have a frock on, apparently, back in the
Right.
60s, you know?
Right. It's probably what these guys did too, right? That's probably was just a camouflage one way or
Sure,
another.
sure.
And I mean, did you ever verify that there was like a anti-Castro Cuban training base outside of New Orleans? Is that verified? And Ferry was involved in it?
Yeah, it was it Lake Pontchartrain. Definitely was a training camp there. This guy, Ricardo Davis, ran it, and he had actually for Dean Andrews as his primary investigator. And of course, Dean Andrews is famous to the case for alleging that he got a phone call asking him to represent Oswald in Dallas by a man by the name of Clay Bertrand.
Gotcha. Bertrand, who they later found out was Clay Shaw, right?
Yeah, he definitely alleged that it was Clay Shaw. He actually told another first generation researcher, Harold Weisberg, in confidence before he passed that Shaw was definitely Bertrand. But then again, things change, William. A couple years ago, there's a reporter down there in Louisiana who came across an actual real person named Clay Bertrand, who used to work at the show bar in New Orleans as a bouncer. And of course, that's a kind of seedy side of town there with a lot of these underground gay bars that a lot of these guys would frequent. So, and at times, Dean Andrews said that Clay Bertrand was a young man, about 6 feet tall, strapping. And other times, of course, he would be resembling Clay Shaw, 6'4", gray hair, very distinguished. So I'm to the point of who knows about Clay Shaw.
Right. But I mean, that's kind of like intel practice, like confusing identities either in the mob or underground. So to me, it's evidence that somebody's trying to obfuscate things.
Well, yeah, it
Much like
doesn't
Oswald
preclude.
supposedly being in Mexico. Do you think that he was in Mexico?
Well, there's certainly no evidence whatsoever that he was, if he was. The pictures and the tapes that the CIA captured him on, supposedly, and sent back here. We have a phone call between J. Edgar Hoover and President Johnson saying that the voice on the tape didn't match Oswald's. And the pictures that we've seen that were sent back that were supposedly taken of Oswald on these cameras that were fixed out, aiming at the embassies, definitely is not Oswald. So, and we have sightings of Oswald in Dallas visiting Sylvia Odio, allegedly. At the same time, he's supposed to be in Mexico. So, that's another big black hole anomaly that you can get stuck down and trying to figure out exactly what happened there.
Right. And I mean, at the day of the shooting, Oswald's there, but there's so many different people there that have cited there. I think there was a story that Howard Hunt drove a car with people right to Dallas, like he was headed to Dallas. Do you think that Hunt was one of the bums or whatever, the hobos?
I don't think he was. And of course, this is all. I mean, there's people that do. There's people that believe it was Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis and
Harrelson.
Woody Harrelson's dad, Charles, and Chauncey Holt is another one who claimed to be the old bum. I don't think it's anybody. I don't think they really had a part in it. And of course, their arrest records were found in the late 80s in the Dallas Police Archives, and it turns out that it wasn't anybody that you've heard of. So I don't put much stock in the tramps being associated with anything. Of course, back in the 60s, when they were still an anomaly and had no answers, I believe Jim Garrison went on the Tonight Show with the pictures of these guys saying, hey, these guys were arrested that day and we don't know who they were.
Gotcha.
which is a valid point, you know.
Right. I mean, and well, didn't somebody see Lansdale on site too in Dallas? Edward Lansdale?
Well,
Or is that
that's
fake
part of
too?
the whole Prouty thing. There's a
Okay.
guy captured in one of the tramp photos walking away, so all you see is the back of his head, the back of his suit, and a hand. And so this was supposedly identified by General Krulak to Prouty as, oh, that looks like Lansdale's ring on his finger, and he has the same gait as Lansdale, which to me doesn't prove anything. I mean, if somebody like a 5-star general was walking through Dealey Plaza right after the assassination, that doesn't make much sense to me. You know, if they were in charge of planning it, my guess is if it was me, I wouldn't be anywhere near Dealey Plaza after the assassination to get caught on film.
Right. Why would, yeah, I mean, it's just a huge event. Everybody fled. It just seems like the shooters fled. Everybody was kind of trying to get out of Dodge. What's your thought? I know somebody who I think you mentioned in one of your podcasts is Joan Mellon, who's been really a long time, multiple decade researcher into the JFK assassination. What's your kind of position regarding her work? I think she just put out another JFK book recently, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I'm definitely a huge fan of her work. She's a big admirer of Jim Garrison and what he was doing down there in New Orleans. And I believe she was down there working with him at the time for some of it. She's got a very fascinating, outlook on the case, as well as I believe she put out a book about DeMore and Shield as well, called Iron Man in Haiti.
Right. DeMore and Shield was definitely like a white Russian kind of elite intel guy. Very strange, but it's very strange too, because he was on the book that I read, The Razor's Edge, Walking the Razor's Edge. DeMore and Shield was having a homosexual affair with the journalist, like the Dutchman. It's off the charts. A lot of these guys were in gay bars too, right? Ferry and what is it? What's the other guy's name? Shaw. I think that's depicted in Stone's JFK movie.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a ton of that. It's like almost a thread running through everything. I mean, there's even allegations of Lee Oswald being gay, of course. And who knows? Yeah, I have one of my shows is called, I effed Lee Harvey Oswald. I came across this document, and it kind of told this like 7-page story of meeting up with Lee Oswald, and for $5 went back to some seedy apartment on Canal Street, and crazy stuff. Yeah, I believe Dean Andrews called him swishy a little bit, so it's, who knows?
The whole case is just redolent with high strangeness. Just everything about it. Like there's just so many weird things. Like even the Ruby case, you talked about Ruby and his trial. Like he's all mobbed up. Like it's just, he's another fascinating character too, right? Rubenstein.
Yeah, Jack Ruby, owner of the Carousel Club. I've always thought, William, it's one thing to have his supposed connections, right? And to have two emphatic nuts in Dallas at the same time, because, your life has to be going a very certain direction to want to murder someone when you haven't committed murder before. You're not a killer. You're a respected Dallas businessman, a business owner, but you're going to throw your whole life away to go in front of 30 policemen, television cameras, to stick a gun in the accused assassin's gut and pull the trigger in front of the world. Somebody either has to have some serious leverage against you to make you do that. I just don't believe somebody is that fanatical.
It just doesn't make sense. It was almost like they brought out Oswald for the shooting. To me, it almost looks like a stage event. Like it didn't look random. Like, okay, we're going to bring him out, make sure that Ruby's ready. I know that may sound strange, but it's like they have the most important person in the world at that time after the president of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, gets shot, and they just brought him out into a crowd. Like, it doesn't make sense. It only makes sense if it was intentional, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
he was
my
wide open too, and
right.
it's mid-morning. They had put it off the transfer. They were going to do it overnight, and they kept putting it off and putting it off. And if you go back and watch the footage with the sound on, there's a very odd timed honking of a horn, if you ask me.
Wow. Like, he's coming out. That's the
Yeah.
signal. Wow.
And
Now
as
we
soon as
gotta
you
get
hear
him
this horn
cleaned up.
honk, yeah, Ruby pops out and shoots him.
It's incredible. And he, Oswald figures it out. He's like, I'm a patsy. I'm trying to, give me some help. Somebody beat him up. And
Yeah, I
I'm
mean,
doing this.
there's a lot of looks. He doesn't say much. We don't have him saying much on camera, but his face at times speaks 1,000 words. Like when at the midnight press conference, when they tell him, "Oh no, you have been charged with the murder of the president," you see his face just drop to the floor, basically, and it's almost like in an instant he figures out what they did to him.
Right. Like, he didn't know the whole thing. Now he gets it. Somebody targeted him. And he was probably just a little, he's probably had some kind of intel element to him. Like, if the head of the FBI knows him and all this stuff, he had to be networked too. He just had to, some kind of low level intel guy they just threw to the wolves, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, and you got to remember too that he could have easily been duped. Okay, I mean, he ordered this rifle under an alias of Alec Heidel, AJ Heidel, to his mother's post office box in New Orleans, and probably figured of course, this was the name that he was using in association with his Fair Play for Cuba committee. I think he had Alec Heidel as the treasurer of this fictitious group, right?
Right.
So if you can align this Alex Heidel with supporting Castro, okay, in New Orleans, and being tied to a rifle found to be the murder weapon of the president in Dallas, maybe Oswald doesn't figure that this rifle could be traced back to him. Maybe the rifle in his mind is supposed to be found tied back to this pro-Castro character in New Orleans, and maybe he just doesn't put two and two together, that it could come back on him.
Right. Like, he doesn't know he's being set up and conditioned for the big event, right?
Right.
Like,
I mean, they could have easily just told him, say, "Hey, look, man, we're gonna take some pot shots at the president, just to scare him enough into doing something about Cuba." When they find out that the rifle had been tied back to some Castro supporter,
right.
that it might piss Kennedy off enough to where he might actually take some action, because a lot of people were upset that Kennedy, didn't really provide air support for the Bay of Pigs. A lot of Cubans died, and a lot of anti-Castro Americans died as well. And a lot of people were very upset at President Kennedy, like upset enough to probably want to take him out.
Right. I mean, he angered everybody. He and his brother angered the mob, the intel community, the anti-Castro Cubans. Like, he had a lot of networks of problems. So,
yeah, and for me, it all comes down. And I've looked at a lot of things over the years. I think I've solved the case just about every year that comes along, and then something will come along and say, "Nope, that makes that theory null and void. You forget that. Okay, let's look at something else." But for some time, from everything I've looked at, to me, it all settles back on the hatred of Kennedy, his treatment of the CIA, and these anti-Castro Cubans. And of course, they're all married together in this weird way.
They're all around. They're around in Watergate. I think you mentioned that in your stuff. You have the anti-Castro Cubans really were the foot soldiers. There's tons of them just around the intel community in Florida and all that stuff. Very angry. And I actually it was the Ghost of Sheridan Circle which is a really fascinating book that I interviewed a guy about the bombing of Letelier in DC. It
Mhm.
was like the only bombing of a guy, another group of anti-Castro Cubans, and
Yeah.
he told me, the author, whose name I can't remember now, but after 63, the anti-Castro Cubans were almost like a terrorist organization. They were bombing people. They were associated with all kinds of criminality because they were angry. And so
Yeah, a lot of it like translated, into Operation Chaos, like out on the West Coast. There was one guy in particular associated with all this stuff. His name's Roy Hargraves, and he was an anti-Castro freedom fighter. He was an American guy, but he believed in the cause. There's a lot of these guys milling around back then, going across the country and believing in the fight so much. That they didn't want this communist guy, 60 miles off the coast of their shore. They were mad at Kennedy because he wouldn't do anything about it. And a lot of these guys were teaming up with the anti-Castro Cubans and going on raids into Cuba, just trying to take it on for themselves because nobody else was doing anything. And these guys were very idealistic in their way of thinking and their beliefs. I mean, enough for them to leave their families, for months on end to go train or go on raids or, just live this crazy life.
right. Well, the Bay of Pigs led directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which scared the living daylights of everybody because it thought it was nuclear war. So that also can amp up or amplify people's anger. I mean, it's just an incredible event. 63 really is something else. I mean, there's so much. What do you think, looking back? You've done this podcast, you're almost at 200 episodes. What are some of the most interesting guests or topics maybe that you've learned of that maybe aren't really known as well to the general public?
Well, there's a couple things that actually came to light, over the past year that are pretty interesting, I'll say. Um, I've had my sights on several key suspects over the years, who, in my opinion, had a hand in, actually pulling this thing off. And there's a fellow by the name of Lauren Hall, who was associated with Jerry Hemming and Interpen and what we call the Gunboat Cowboys down there. And he actually spent some time in a Cuban prison with Santos Traficante, people like John Martino. And he would come back here, and he was very, very right wing. And he would even, go to these different organizations and do these rallies and speeches and collect money and guns. And he was actually arrested in Dallas, moving guns to Florida in October of 63. So he's one of these main, what I call a main character. Now, what was interesting this past year, his stepson came forward after all these years. Of course, Lauren Hall's been dead for quite a while. Because they found a rifle in the attic of their house. And it happened to be a Mannlicher Carcano rifle. Only this one was a 7.35 millimeter instead of a 6.5 millimeter. And so the story goes, of course, his stepson was a young teenager, I believe, at the time. He said about a week after the assassination, his stepdad came home and gave him this rifle and told him to hide it somewhere and never speak of it again. And at the time, of course, he didn't really put two and two together. He didn't know anything was going on. And apparently this wasn't odd behavior for his stepfather. He was around weapons all the time, but this particular rifle came back out, and very interesting story, especially when you start putting two and two together, with Josiah Thompson's new research that there was a shot from the grassy knoll. Because apparently he told his stepson a little later years, that there was a shooter on the grassy knoll and that there was somebody there to make sure that the shot was taken.
Gotcha. There was like a backup
Yeah.
ensuring that it happened. It probably was each shooting team probably did the same thing, right?
Yeah. I
Probably
mean,
had groups like 2 or 3 guys.
if you really look at the stuff in Dealey Plaza and like in the Mormon photograph and certain ones that have been cleaned up, you can kind of see a figure, popping up over the picket fence there. And of course, it was alleged by several witnesses that people were seen behind that picket fence, puffs of smoke, etc., wafting out over the overpass, and that's where everybody was running at,
Right.
after the shots.
You can still see that movie of them running towards the fence, right? There's a
Yeah,
film of that somebody watched. Yeah.
and so that's all that points to me is that something happened up there, and there probably was shots from the rear, but I'm pretty sure that they didn't come from the 6th floor of the school book depository. There was plenty of other buildings back there that provided a lot better shots, easier access and ingress and egress, if you will, to get away.
Right. I've heard the Daltech building, people speculated.
Yeah, the Daltex building, the county records building. So yeah, much more, it just makes much more sense to me. And of course, there's 2 figures that haven't really been, out of all the people, over the years, that have been identified in Dealey Plaza at the time of the shots, captured on film, that you can say, okay, this is this person, that's that person, this is this person, we know who that is, we know who that is. There's 2 people that we have no idea who they are. Now, one of them is the so-called Umbrella Man, who allegedly came forward during the HSCA investigation and claimed to be, I forget what his name was, Louis Witt, I believe. And, he stated that he had the umbrella up and he was pumping it up and down as a protest of some kind of World War I thing about the Kennedys that probably nobody would have gotten, right?
Right.
And the other fellow is this guy named the Dark Complected Man, who was actually standing in the street. He was the closest person. It wasn't the Newmans, the family that you see, covering their children. This guy, this Cuban guy, what it looks to me like, in a blue shirt, is actually standing in the street right next to the limousine as Kennedy's head is blown off, and his arm is up and he has a fist up. And that guy has never been identified. Nobody's ever come forward to claim to be him over the years. And from what we can, the close-ups, you can only get so much. And of course, the photographic evidence is very selective. People have a lot of different opinions about all the photographic evidence, and everybody can have opinions. And it's nothing conclusive, but to me, it looks a whole lot like this anti-Castro Cuban fellow by the name of Felipe Vidal Santiago and his buddy Roy Hargraves.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So Roy Hargraves
as the Umbrella Man, as they sit there on the curb. And actually, Roy Hargraves was interviewed for Noel Twyman's book called Bloody Treason in the mid-90s. And this part of it didn't make it into Noel Twyman's book, but Larry Hancock reprinted it in his book called Someone Would Have Talked, which is full of people that did talk. And Roy Hargraves admitted to the authors that he was in Dallas on November the 22nd, 1963, and that his job there was as a demolitions expert. He said that there was a vehicle on the other side of that overpass wired to blow in case whatever happened in Dealey Plaza didn't work.
Wow. So they had a backup plan. Wow. Incredible.
And if you look closely at this so-called dark complected man in Dealey Plaza, various photos, it looks like he has something in the back of his jacket. And even in other photos, it looks like he's on some kind of a radio with an antenna and everything. So it's very odd stuff.
It's just so many different people. This guy, I was looking up Lauren Hall. There's a picture of him on the SpartacusEducational.com, but he says, I was a radical right wing. I was a reactionary. Almost every meeting that I ever went to, I heard somebody plotting or talking about somebody should blow Kennedy's head off. So,
Yeah.
that environment.
He's the real deal, man. I mean, he alleges, to have been in many meetings in Dallas with big, right-wing guys that supposedly offered him $50,000 to kill Kennedy.
Right. Like, and there's wealthy people. There's the trucking brothers or whatever. There were military guys who were super far right wing. I think one of them, like somebody shot through his house or something before the event. There's all kinds of deep things going on. And the name of Josiah Thompson's book is Last Second in Dallas. So that just came out at the beginning of 2021 if people want to look at that. But it has like 223 5-star reviews. I should reach out to him. Do you mind taking a few questions? Here's one from We Steals Play-Doh Snakes. Can you ask the guest if there's any clarification that Oswald had ties to the trash bag killer? I don't know who the trash bag killer is. Do you?
I think maybe I'm thinking of the ice pick killer. There was somebody alleged, I think it was Charles Rogers. I think he ended up murdering his parents and stuffing them in trash bags. He was allegedly a shooter on the grassy knoll, another one. I don't believe that this tramp was Charles Rogers. And I don't believe Oswald had any ties to him whatsoever. No.
Yeah, where's the best place for people to listen to your show, right? I mean, you could just find it on any podcast distributor, right?
Yeah, anywhere and everywhere, Apple, Stitcher. Anywhere, pretty much. Just Google it. Yeah, it'll pop up.
And do you have what episode you're at now? 193, 194. And do you where's the best place if people want to reach out to you? Do you have a website or social media?
Yeah, they can always find me on Twitter at the Lone Gunman 7. And I also have a Facebook page. It's just search for the Lone Gunman Podcast. And feel free to message me either place. I will answer.
And really interesting. I mean, you've done tons of work, tons of different subjects, and people can go send that out. Anything you'd like to add or anything I missed before we wrap it up?
I saw there was another question.
Somebody said something about Frank Sturgis. I think to background Sturgis affiliation. Let's see. FBI got a telex. Maybe I missed it. Let's see. Dean Andrew was the lawyer. John Candy played. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So Dean, it's kind of like, I mean, New Orleans at that time it's always kind of been very corrupt, right? Just very fast and loose with the law. The sensibilities are different. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, totally different time and era.
Awesome. Well, great job. Again, the name of the podcast is the Lone Gunman Podcast. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And a guest was Rob Clark. So, Rob, thanks so much for your time.
Oh, and William, real quick, let me also tell everybody I also do another podcast called Quick Hits, a news and notes JFK assassination podcast with my buddy Doug Campbell, who is the host of the Dallas Action Podcast. And we do that one together. We got about 25 or 30 episodes of that as well. So if you dig it, you'll dig that one.
Awesome. So that was Quick Hits. And then what was the second one again? Say that.
His podcast is called The Dallas Action, and it's all about the Kennedy assassination as well.
Gotcha. Cool. I'll put those in the show notes too. If you send those links over too, that'd be great.
Sure.
Again, Rob Clark, thanks so much. Have a good day.
Thank you, William.
All right, take care.
Thank you.